Topic 4. Who was to blame for the Cold War? The word blame implies wrongdoing, someone spoiling something. The thing that was spoiled was the grand alliance between the USA, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union to defeat Hitler's Germany and Japan. It was formed during World War II. Here we have a photo of the three leaders in Tehran in October 1943. And this was the first time an American president had ever met a Soviet leader. The alliance involved the supply of American weapons to help Stalin in his terrible war in the East. The Grand Alliance also had in mind some sort of international cooperation after the war, a kind of League of Nations. And in fact, the Allies called themselves the United Nations Against Fascism. And it was that name, the United Nations, that Roosevelt favoured. Now, the IGCSE syllabus asks us this focus point 1. Why did the US-Soviet alliance begin to break down? In a sense, it's very easy to answer, because the alliance was, after all, just an alliance of temporary convenience. Virtually the only thing the Americans and the Russians had in common was being at war with Hitler and Mussolini. But once the European fascists were defeated, and preferably dead, it was widely expected that the American-Soviet hostility that was there before World War II would simply resume after it. Why? Well, remember that ever since the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Soviet regime was seen as deeply dangerous by the Americans. In fact, it was not until 1933, when Roosevelt himself was elected, that America even acknowledged Stalin as the leader of this country. It had taken the USA, that's to say, 15 years to even recognise the USSR as a legitimate state. This table indicates the principal ideological differences between the American and Soviet systems. On the face of it, the Soviet Union was committed to the overthrow of America's and indeed the world's capitalist system. This poster is celebrating the so-called Communist International. From 1919, the Comintern was a meeting of leading communists from all around the world who discussed tactics of how best to coordinate a revolution to overthrow capitalism. Well, they never seriously attempted it, of course, but the imagery, this muscular worker smashing the chains that are binding the world, or here on the right, Lenin sweeping away the moneymakers and kings and priests of the capitalist world from the face of the earth. This shows the ideology of international socialism. That is, only once the world is fully communist will the revolution's work be complete. So, moving on to 1941, this is the year that brought the two together. Hitler launched his massive invasion of the Soviet Union alongside his allies, Hungary, Romania, and others. And at the end of 1941, Japan attacked the USA at Pearl Harbor, and Hitler declared war on the USA 4 days later. So now the Russian and American fates were intertwined. This was why this meeting at Tehran was called, to start the dialogue of what the world would look like once fascism was defeated. Now, the Tehran meeting went quite well. Here, Stalin is receiving a gift from Churchill. It's the Sword of Stalingrad, which Churchill gave him in recognition of the effort of the Russian people at the Battle of Stalingrad. They also agreed that there would be more summit conferences. And so the 1945 summit conferences, and in particular this one in Yalta, are the high point of cooperation and the beginning of our course. Now, it's February, and the European situation looked like this great pink net closing in around Hitler, bunkered here in Berlin. Now, there were a number of issues that were going to be key and were on the agenda at Yalta. One, what would be the future status of Germany? The most urgent task, of course, was to arrest the Nazi leaders and arrange for war crimes trials. The Allies could agree on that. Two, would Germany remain as a single entity? Or would it be better to forever split it up into the tiny units that people remembered from the 19th century? It was agreed that whilst Germany deep into the future would be a single country, it would be temporarily split into 4 occupation zones, here including the French, as you'll see, who attained that section of territory right next to their border. Stalin was also forced into agreeing that the Allies would divide Berlin, the capital, itself. As we'll see, a pro-Allied West Berlin was going to cause Stalin problems later on. 3. Reparations. Now look at these figures, and the cost of war, fighting it and the damage done, was estimated to be around about $1 trillion in 1940s prices for the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin asked only for around a tenth of that and at least got Roosevelt to admit the principle of repayment. Now, Germany was relatively easy, but a tougher one, the 4th issue, was Poland. Why was Poland tougher? Well, remember that the war had broken out when Britain tried to defend Poland after Hitler attacked it. So a free Poland was very important to the West. An independent Poland would be a counterbalance to Germany and, of course, to Soviet Russia itself. Stalin saw things differently. He wanted to retain the gains that he had made in his pact with Hitler before the war. You will know that after the pact, there was a massacre by Stalin's secret police of Polish officers here in Katyn in 1940. And the Polish government in exile, we've got a photograph here of them, had spent the war in safety in London. They're nicknamed the London Poles, but they were eager to resume their position and be restored to power. Would Stalin accept that? He refused. He'd already set up a temporary pro-communist administration of his own in Lublin, the so-called Lublin Poles. So all of these facts indicated that the USSR had no intention of Poland emerging post-war as independent or strong or anti-communist. The best that Roosevelt achieved was to get Stalin to agree to a Yalta Declaration, which promised the principle of free elections after the war in Poland and all other liberated territories. Would Stalin stick to it? Time would tell. 2 more Yalta achievements can be added, which was agreed to by all 3. Number 1, the formation of a United Nations, of which these 3 would of course be permanent members with vetoes. And lastly, and not least, Stalin did agree to join in America's war against the Japanese at some later date, though no date was given. So could Yalta be considered a success? Undoubtedly it can. What was harder was to follow up on this. Remember that Stalin said that Yalta was the algebra, the principles, but the next conference, which was at Potsdam, would be the arithmetic, by which he meant actually making the calculations of where these borders would be and how much these reparations would be and what war crimes trials would actually look like. All that working out would be much tougher. And here are the big three at Potsdam. Hitler, of course, now dead. The Allies victorious in Europe. And just to rub it in, they've decided to meet in this palace just outside Berlin at Potsdam. You'll see there's also this important change of personnel. In the middle, the much more tough-minded Harry Truman, because Roosevelt had died in April. And his vice president, Truman, had been saying, I am tired of babying the Soviets. So he wanted a tougher line. For instance, Truman had no intention of involving the Soviets in the defeat and occupation of Japan. In fact, he warned Stalin rather darkly that the Americans had a new weapon, the atomic bomb, which he would order to be used only 1 month later. On the left is Attlee, who defeated Churchill in the 1945 election and was now leading a new Labour government. So, first, the Potsdam Agreement. The protocol was to insist on a complete disarmament and demilitarization of Germany. That's to say, all aspects of the German military and all aspects of industry that supported it would be dismantled. Arrest of war criminals and the conduct of war trials with Russian, American and British judges. An Allied Control Commission would run the country and oversee things like reconstruction, getting energy supplies back, shelter for refugees. So this Allied Control Commission was essentially a coming together of all of the leading generals of the occupation zones. A conference of ministers would be set up to start negotiations for a peace treaty. And we must stress this point that Potsdam wasn't a peace treaty. It was an interim arrangement. One trick question could be, what is the name of the peace treaty after World War II? I mean, everyone knows that Versailles ended World War I, but then they'd scratch their heads if they thought, well, what was the treaty that ended World War II? And the answer is, of course, there wasn't one. The Soviets and the Americans could not and did not reach final agreements on other key areas. And this, of course, is why they ended up in what we call a Cold War, a situation of neither peace nor of outright war. Before we define Cold War, it's worth dwelling on the issues that were not resolved at Potsdam or later. These will be the issues that made the Cold War the state of affairs for the next 45 years. Issue number one: what would be the future government of a united Germany? Well, the Americans wanted a democratic election, a free market system. The Soviets feared that if that went ahead, it would be a pro-American puppet state on their doorstep. Stalin wanted a more Soviet-friendly system established. No agreement was reached. There was some kind of agreement on how much compensation the Russians should get. It was agreed that 10% of Germany's industrial capacity could be dismantled and shipped east, and that the Russians could use captured German soldiers as forced labour. But as far as the Russians were concerned, this was just the beginning. Again, no further concrete agreement on Soviet reparations. And what of Eastern Europe? Soviet troops had conquered Hungary, had conquered Romania, had conquered Bulgaria. Whereas in the West, Britain and America felt that they had liberated France. Of course, France hadn't attacked America, but each of the countries that I've just mentioned in the East, Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria, had joined in on the attack of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet attitude was therefore much more vengeful about the countries that they now found themselves in possession of. Stalin wanted a number of things. He wanted reparations, but he also wanted a political system established in those countries that he knew would be friendly to the USSR and would never join a new coalition against it. So Roosevelt's Yalta Declaration, which we said was the great achievement for the West, was actually not going to stop Stalin, ensuring that those post-war elections in the Eastern European countries would yield pro-Soviet governments. So again, no agreement was reached on the arrangements for these countries. And top of the list of those countries would be Poland itself. I think in many ways, this was the issue that Stalin was just not going to give way on. Poland was, in his view, the barrier to any future attack from the West. And with that in mind, he wanted to retain this territory here in the East, in grey, which he'd acquired in 1939 as a consequence of the Nazi-Soviet pact. Stalin's offer to Truman was that Poland would be compensated in the West. At this territory in pink on the left, remember, is almost exclusively a German area, but would be awarded to the new Poland. Stalin hopes a kind of Soviet Poland, right up to the Oder-Neisse line. So this was right at the last minute agreed to by Truman. But what the three could not agree on was some final arrangement for the government of Poland, who would be in it. And Truman said it should involve the London Poles that we discussed. That was the deal at Yalta, but this didn't happen. So no agreement was reached over the future government of Poland. Focus point 2 now becomes easier to answer. How had the USSR gained control of Eastern Europe? You don't need that many examples. We'll go straight to the Polish example. It's the best and the most important. This Polish patriot, Michalczyk, was a leading Polish freedom fighter during World War II, and he resurrected the Polish People's Party here in opposition to Stalin's Lublin Committee. But you'll see in the election result, the Democratic bloc has won 80% of the seats and the Polish People's Party has been obliterated. Democratic bloc, it's a misnomer. It was in fact a coalition of groups who were acting on Stalin's orders, and therefore the election had been fixed in favour of tried and trusted pro-Stalin communists. So method 1 was to fix elections and give the pro-Stalin parties names that seemed national, that seemed as if they were Polish parties rather than Russian ones. So Michalczyk is forced to flee for his life, which brings us to a second and related method, which is the establishment of political police. I think Hungary is the best example here. This is the AVH, which means the State Protection Authority. Protection against what? Well, remember, Hungary had fought against the Soviet Union. It had not only fascists, but millions of sympathisers to the Hungarian fascist regime. So this police force is given enormous powers to arrest and stop public meetings and root out anyone who had that kind of history in World War II in Hungary. They, of course, also stopped all anti-Soviet demonstrations at the same time. So it was very hard for Hungarian politicians after World War II to set up parties that would be anything other than pro-Stalin communist parties. This leads us on to a third method, and we'll stay with Hungary. It's such a good example because of all the states that the Soviets took over, the Hungarians were historically the most anti-Russian. We've said Hungarian troops joined in on Hitler's invasion of Russia, rather enthusiastically, in fact. They'd had a fascist government. So when Soviet troops swept in from the east in 1944, they were conquerors, in no mood to be lenient. This 1945 election result in Hungary was just what Stalin didn't want. A party called the Smallholders has won. A smallholding, of course, is a farm. Here's a photo of the sort of landowning farmers who made up so much of Hungarian society. And the majority of the population were pro-property, pro-free market trade. What happened? Well, the Hungarian State Protection Authority, the AVH we mentioned, were put under orders to crush the Smallholders Party. A new election was called, and here are the results. And you'll see that just as with the situation in Poland, the very many parties have now been merged. This time it's called a front, placed under kind of communist leaders. So in fact, there's no opposition at all. They've either been put in jail, or these parties have been made tame. They've been put into this independent front under communist leaders. And the front then conducted a Soviet policy of collectivizing the small holdings, removing these farmers. And if they were going to continue working on the land, had to work in these vast collective state farms. Collectivization. So the Sovietization of Eastern Europe isn't just political, it also means turning Eastern European societies into Soviet social systems, putting people into collective farms, putting people into state-owned industries, all on the Stalinist model. So, what methods have we identified? We've identified manipulating democratic elections into Soviet-managed elections, preventing opposition's ability to organize or protest or publish, and Sovietizing society. That's to say, eliminating so-called class enemies and establishing states in which those societies are made up of workers and peasants. All of these actions were possible because of the presence of Soviet troops after the war, and was enforced by secret police forces that were established under Moscow's supervision. Now, focus point 3 asks, how did the United States react to Soviet expansionism? I think it was clear to the Americans, by everything we've looked at, that the communists were going to take over much of post-war Europe. You'll remember that in 1946, Churchill warned an American audience of this in his famous Iron Curtain speech. A famous telegram, the long telegram, written by an American official, George Kennan, characterized Soviet foreign policy. There were other warning signs for the Americans, even in Western Europe. Here are the election results in Italy. In 1946, for instance, socialists and communists were easily the most popular of the parties. So Truman then had a worry. Could it be possible that in even the democratic West, countries such as Italy and France would kind of elect to become pro-communist. The test case was in Greece. Historically, of course, as Churchill warned, the cradle of democracy. At the end of World War II, Nazi forces had surrendered to British troops. And when the King of Greece, George II, returned, he got himself involved in a bitter civil war. Some Greeks, many Greeks, became communist insurgents, and they wouldn't accept the restoration of a monarchy under British supervision. King George had hoped that a protection force of British troops could help him out, but Clement Attlee wrote to tell Truman and the Americans in February 1947 that he was no longer able to afford to keep them there. Britain was pulling out of Greece. Why, therefore, does Truman ask Congress for this sum of money to be sent in military aid to King George? The Truman Doctrine is the basis of the American policy of containment. That's to say, this focus point. It was the first time that Americans would intervene in a foreign conflict in peacetime. This was abandoning their traditional policy of isolationism from European politics. For this reason, the newspapers defined it as a new and distinctive foreign policy, hence doctrine, Truman Doctrine. Truman had three motives, I think. One, to prevent neighbouring Yugoslav communists from intervening and turning Greece into an anti-Western state. It was Tito, in fact. It wasn't Stalin who was behind Elas, this communist fighting force. Truman's second motive was to safeguard the Eastern Mediterranean from falling into Soviet hands. Greece and Turkey received weapons and food in 1947, and later on they ultimately joined NATO. The third motive is to make up for Britain's weakness. It was quite clear that Great Britain was not going to be able to resume its pre-war world position. The British Empire was in a state of collapse, and its finances were even worse. The second arm of Truman's active containment was economic rather than political and military. His Secretary of State, George Marshall, announced the European Recovery Programme, nicknamed Marshall Aid, to reconstruct the physical environment of Europe's cities, which were bombed out during World War II. Marshall set aside $13 billion for this purpose, mainly in grants and a fifth of it in repayable loans. From an American point of view, the Marshall Plan was the financial antidote to communism. America was concerned that if Europe was still in a rationing system, for instance, and there were shortages, communism would become attractive to poorer members of the population. This famously harsh winter in 1946-7, we've got this photo of the Thames being frozen over, just worsened these conditions. And America thought was turning Europe's war-torn populations towards the politicians who would promise them easy material solutions. In a way, the American plan was also a sort of socialist action. Millions of dollars on state projects to get people back to work and to rebuild economy and to rebuild physical structures. Truman would never have admitted that. But if Europeans knew it was US dollars that were kickstarting their recovery, then they were likely to be grateful. And moreover, if European industries could re-establish themselves sufficiently to become successful trading partners with the USA, then capitalism as a system would be apparently safe and literally delivering the goods. To the Soviets, the Marshall Plan was unacceptable. This was a form of economic domination. The Americans were offering everyone financial aid, even the Soviets themselves. And in this apparent gift, Stalin saw a threat, as this cartoon shows. To be in debt to the United States would be to be forever under their power. What looks like a life belt in this cartoon is actually a magnet. America, in return for this money, would want information on the economies. They would want to know where that money was being planning, and to Stalin that was just a form of espionage. Second, the Soviets knew that many of the contracts for reconstruction would of course be signed by American companies and therefore continue America's extraordinary economic boom. In 1947, over a half of the world's manufacturers were being made in the USA. So wasn't Marshall Aid a mechanism to continue the expansion of American capitalism? Stalin forbade any of the Eastern European states under his control to accept Marshall Aid. Harry Truman's most aggressive stance against the Soviets was ultimately taken, though, in the western sectors of Germany. You will remember that this map shows French, American, and British occupation zones. You'll also remember this arrangement was supposed to be temporary. That is, the Allies were supposed to get together and sign the peace treaty that would determine how withdrawal would take place and what sort of political system would replace it, and what sort of economic arrangements would be operating in Germany. But as we've seen, that peace treaty was never signed. In fact, the meetings between the Americans and Soviets became less frequent and then finally broke down in December 1947. Why the bad feeling? Well, the Americans were angry at Russian interference in Eastern European elections, as we've just seen. The Soviets were angry at Americans sending equipment and forces to Greece and Turkey, as we've just seen. And so Truman and Marshall authorized actions in the Western sectors that, in Russian eyes, looked like they were preparing to create a kind of West German state, that they were separately developing it. What do we mean? Well, firstly, in January 1947, the American and British zones were unified into Bizonia. And these zones would, of course, receive Marshall Aid. In defiance of the Potsdam Agreement, the Americans encouraged the recreation of the great German industrial companies, such as the electronic manufacturer AEG, a very good example. Oddly, even the French were supportive. For instance, French companies had been heavily dependent on German chemicals, German steel, and the French government was by this stage actively encouraging the Americans to allow these German firms to resume their business. This was a provocation to the Soviets. Many of these companies, only a few years before, had been literally running the Nazi war machine. And probably more annoying was the fact that the sectors in the west of Germany were historically rich industrial areas, whereas in the east, of course, the Soviets possessed the poorer agricultural region. And worse news was to come for Stalin, and this was the fact that in 1948, the Americans had been printing a new currency in secret, the Deutschmark. Nobody wanted to handle the old money that had Hitler's insignia on it. Everyone was expecting a new currency to be made. But of course, this was going to be issued only in the Western sector. And the Russians were left dealing with the old redundant currency in the East. Where, in which city would this difference between the new money backed by the American dollar and the old be most keenly felt? Well, of course, in Berlin itself. where the American and Soviet sectors sat side by side in this single city. Well, of course, Berliners were going to want to get their hands on the new printed, crisply made Deutschmark. And so the creation of this new currency, in secret against Stalin's will, convertible into the dollar, of course, was made in April 1948, and without Soviet say-so, Stalin had just had enough. He complained to the Allied Control Commission and then in June 1948 ordered his troops to blockade the traffic routes in and out of the Western Berlin sector, to cut off energy supply, water supply, and end the entry of all goods that were being transported from Western Germany on the high roads and railways. Focus point 4 asks us, what were the consequences of Stalin's Berlin blockade? And the first consequence is simple. West Berliners lost their freedom of movement. They had to ration food and energy, coal obviously. It's likely their view of Stalin became very negative. This was clearly an attempt to force the Allies out once and for all. Second consequence is the American relief effort, their response. This slide gives some statistics as to the extent of the Berlin airlift. General Clay, the commanding officer in West Germany, had considered using tanks to smash through the blockade, but Truman sensibly ruled that out. It would have escalated into a full-scale conflict, and that would have been unthinkable. So Truman's decision was to attempt to supply West Berlin from the air in the hope that support for West Berlin would embarrass Stalin into backing down. I think this photograph of these West Berlin children playing with their toy American aircraft indicates that it was actually a propaganda victory for Truman. The airlift carried on and on into 1949, and the division of the city actually had a negative impact on the Soviet sector too, which was dependent indeed on many things being supplied from West Berlin. The third consequence is the most fundamental of all, and this is to do with Germany's overall political future. Announcements were made for an election to be held in the Western sectors for a unified West German parliament and a chancellor. This is now April 1949. And of course, this would be the final nail in the coffin for a peace treaty over Germany, because unilaterally, the French, British, and Americans were pressing ahead with the separate development of a new West German state, the so-called Federal Republic of Germany. The fourth consequence of Stalin's blockade is just as profoundly important for Cold War history. The Americans needed a mechanism to protect West Berlin from attack. And so they formed a new defence alliance, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was principally to defend any new West German state against Soviet attack. This was the first formal peacetime mutual defence alliance that America had undertaken with anyone, let alone with European countries. And this was the profoundest, and if you're watching the news, remains the profoundest challenge to Russia's sense of security. Well, Stalin had to call off the Berlin blockade, and the Soviets pressed ahead with their own communist state in East Germany, the German Democratic Republic, and ultimately its own corresponding defence organisation, the so-called Warsaw Pact. He also built a trading organisation in an attempt to match the Marshall Plan, which is called the Comecon, or Community of Economies. You're now in a position to address the last focus point: who was the more to blame for starting the Cold War, the United States or the USSR? There's a straightforward debate to be had here, and it is, of course, your choice. There is no right or wrong answer. Just very briefly, the best arguments to blame Stalin revolve around his policies in Eastern Europe. Stalin clearly broke his promises at Yalta and Potsdam to oversee free and fair elections in Eastern Europe. The regimes that he established in these countries were oppressive police states, and they soon became deeply unpopular with many people in those countries. His imposition of the Soviet system in foreign countries without the population's consent was an aggressive policy which the Americans felt compelled to oppose. But the Americans also broke undertakings at the peace summits. As we've seen, their collaboration with the British and the French to create a new German state was to their own advantage. West Germany joined NATO, it formed a capitalist economy, and from a Soviet point of view, very many of the military, industrial, and official people who'd supported Hitler's war in Nazi Germany were just able to resume their public lives in the Federal Republic of Germany. On the other hand, Stalin's blockade of Berlin, which made the division of Germany inevitable, was only one of many examples in 1948 of Soviet refusal to continue cooperation with the Allies. And it ended completely in the spring of 1948. Here's the scandal of the murder of the Czech foreign minister, Masaryk, who fell from a window. Well, he'd been campaigning for the Czechs to receive Marshall aid, and Stalin had refused. Had he been pushed? The Allies thought so. And so it was probably out of anger at the accusations being made that he'd been killed by their police that the Soviets then pulled out of the Allied Control Commission meetings. Certainly, the Americans' decision to form NATO, to announce the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, in opposition to Greek communist rebels, appeared as a form of imperialism in Russian eyes. After all, America was projecting its power from a different continent into areas that the Soviets considered to be within their continent. We haven't even mentioned Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb on Japan in August 1945, even though it was clear Japanese were looking for some kind of surrender. So Truman's decision to drop the bomb is very often seen as the first shot fired in the Cold War. Was that an act of aggression? So therefore, in military, political, economic, and ideological ways, the Soviets saw America to be a threat to them. Stalin considered confrontational non-cooperation to be the best way to preserve the USSR. Where does the truth lie? That's for you to decide.